Can't decide and torn between a romantic, comedy, action, or an indie film to watch for the weekend? Well. Golden State Media Concepts Movie Podcast is your ultimate guide to the latest movies. Join us as we dissect the latest on the blockbusters. It's the Golden State Media Concepts Movie Podcast.
Hello and welcome to the GSMC Movie Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'm your host, Heidi. Sadly, I am not joined by the wonderful Ariane, but I hope that she is being wonderful somewhere else. And today, we are talking about Will Ferrell, specifically about the films Holmes and Watson, which is out in theaters now, and then we're also going to do a bit of a throwback and talk about one of his earlier dramatic roles in the movie Stranger Than Fiction. I really like Will Ferrell. I know that is a controversial statement. Not everyone feels so happy about him, but I'm into it. I like him. I think he's funny. Yes, I realize that the humor is dumb. We will talk about that. And also I realize I can't really say this episode is a tribute to him, mostly because we're talking about Holmes and Watson, which is really not his best work. Not that I'm necessarily saying it's the fault of him, but it's a strange movie. In case you haven't heard about the film Holmes and Watson, it is out in theaters now. So I believe it came out on Christmas Day, 2018. And it is directed by Ethan Coen and written by him as well. It stars Will Ferrell as Sherlock Holmes, John C. Reilly as Dr. Watson, Ralph Fiennes is in it as Moriarty, Lauren Lapkus as Millie, Rebecca Hall as Dr. Grace Hart, Kelly MacDonald as Ms. Hudson. You have Steve Coogan as Gustav Klinger. And you have Hugh Laurie as Mycroft, who is Sherlock Holmes' brother. Pretty good cast, I would say. And of course, you get a reunion of Will Ferrell and John C. Reilly, who I am a big fan of John C. Reilly. I mentioned this in the Wreck-It Ralph episode. I really do like him. I thought he did great as a voice actor as Wreck-It Ralph. And I was really happy to see them come together. I loved Talladega Nights. It's one of my favorite movies. And I loved him and Ferrell in that film together. They just make a great group of pair of buddies in a classic buddy comedy. I will talk about that later, about the idea of buddy comedies and kind of like comedies where you bring in like your best friends to make a funny movie, which is interesting and something that I haven't really thought and meditated on too much in the past. But very briefly, this movie is really a humorous take on the classic Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's classic, the classic Sherlock Holmes, which is a mystery series, and it features Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson. This is a humorous take on that, starring, again, Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson, but it is Will Ferrell and John C. Reilly. So it's just full of humor. There are some, attempts to solve crimes. I guess successful, but yeah, you can imagine that it's not intelligently done, which is really ironic since Sherlock Holmes is classically the super smart, like logic-only detective, and I mean, they kind of portray him as, yes, a man just of logic, but it is not a smart comedy. It really isn't super clever, which is kind of why I think this film is doing really poorly right now. And yeah, it's an odd film. So, to break down what I want to talk about in this episode, really it all just boils down to the fact that this film is strange. And as I had stated earlier, I really like Will Ferrell, and I enjoy his comedies, and you would probably think, well, Heidi, aren't his other comedies weird and odd? Yes, Talladega Nights is weird. It's about NASCAR. It's kind of silly. It is strange. Elf, about a a man who is raised by elves in the North Pole. Yes, strange and odd. But this has had sort of like its own different version of odd. For starters, it's a terrible film. I'm just going to say it. It's really not very good. It's not funny. Right now, it has a 9% rating on Rotten Tomatoes. That is very bad. And really, people have been reported to be walking out of theaters during the film. So they have paid for their ticket and they don't care. They're going to walk out. They're not going to watch it and waste their time. I am saddened by this because, again, I like Will Ferrell and I want him to keep making movies. And I like John C. Reilly. I want the two of them to make more comedies together. Nobody likes it. Critics hate it. They have been very cruel. And I went to go see it because my boyfriend also loves Will Ferrell. And he has been telling me about this film for months. And every time I'm like, oh yeah, they're coming out with a new Sherlock Holmes. He's like, yes, I have told you previously they're, producing it. And it's been in production for however many years and et cetera, et cetera. So that's why I really knew about it. And there wasn't a lot of press and there wasn't a lot of advertising for this. So I think that could be part of the reason it has been doing super well. Granted, even if there were advertisements, that would still not save this. Also, the film has had some controversy around it, and I even read a very interesting article that I want to talk more about later, which mentions that this movie could sort of like be the sign of the end times of comedies, which I, again, will come back to later, but really interesting to read about the take on big theater, like blockbuster comedies, like strictly comedies, like Talladega Nights and whatnot, not like Thor Ragnarok, which is an action film with a comedic take or with a lot of jokes, but strict big blockbuster comedies. So I want to mention that later. Let me just start though. This is not a funny film. I'm so sorry. So this is my first point. My first point is that it's not funny. As I said before, I like Will Ferrell. I really like Talladega Nights. I love Elf. It's my favorite Christmas movie, as I mentioned in the Christmas episode. I like Anchorman, the first and the second. I think the first is still better, but I do love Anchorman. And I like all of, most of his other films. There are some bad ones. I mean, I'm looking at you, Semi-Pro. It was not great, but I generally like Will Ferrell. I also think he's just very funny in stand-up and like on interviews and whatnot. I always love watching the Conan episodes when Will Ferrell is on. And I can say that, yes, most of his films, really all of his comedies, are filled with stupid humor. Like Will Ferrell he just yells at things. He acts kind of like a child. He just gets that stupid look on his face. And I think it's funny. And that's not to say that I think everyone should think that he is funny or that everyone does, because I know not everyone likes his films. And that's okay. Humor can be like that. It can be dividing. Some people might like it. Some may not. That's all right. But I do want to say this film is not just stupid humor. It's just stupid. Again, I'm so sorry, Will. Not that you listen to this, but just in case. And yes, I know you, so we will go on first name basis. But I would say it's really not stupid humor in this film. It's just stupid. It's not well done. There are a few parts that I did laugh at. In general, I enjoyed the character Millie, who is played by Lauren Lapkus. And in the character Millie, we are told that the character was found by another character, Dr. Grace Hart, and that Dr. Grace Hart raised Millie because when they found her, she had just been living with feral cats. So basically, she was raised with feral cats and had the mental abilities of a fourth grader, which, yes, this whole little plot point is very stupid. But then Dr. Grace Hart found her and took her in and is sort of just like, she's like her experiment subject. She's just like trying to figure out like how she's doing. And her joke is that she believes by an electric shock she could raise her IQ to the 6th grade level, because it's like making a joke about old-timey medicine and how, lobotomies and you just shock someone and hoping they can go back to being sane, which of course doesn't happen. And the joke is like, yes, most of my patients will live even a week after the treatment. So I think that part to me was funny. The character Millie was funny. And then later on in the movie, there is a scene when Millie gives Sherlock a letter, and the letter is just a really badly drawn picture of a cat, which somehow means something to Sherlock that's like insulting and heartbreaking. And I did laugh at that part, I thought that was kind of funny, but there is also another scene that I really didn't like, which involves like the Queen of England and Sherlock Holmes and Watson, and that is one of the first times in a while that I can remember just sitting in a theater or watching a comedy and being like, this is just terrible. Like, I felt like the scene was too long. I didn't think it was even funny to begin with. I just didn't like the premise, and I did not think that part was funny, but I did like the Millie character. In general, really, that was like the only part that I thought was funny. There were other parts that I kind of like chuckled at, I guess, but I really didn't think they were that good. So yeah, I didn't think it was great. I'm so sorry, Will. It's just not your best work. But I watched the film. I stayed in the theater for the whole time. I paid for my ticket, and yes, I had to watch it so that I could talk to you all about it. I couldn't leave, but no one in my theater walked out. Granted, there were only like 4 other people who were watching it. I did not see it the day that it came out, but I can't imagine theaters were very packed anyway, which they weren't. Box office sales are not good. It wasn't very heavily, maybe anticipated is the right word. Opening night was not very heavily attended. That brings me to my second point about this, which is that people have been walking out, as I said. I get why. As I said, it's not very funny. It's stupid. Not even really stupid humor. It's just kind of stupid. Anyway, Will Ferrell, I hope that you can enjoy the money that you got from my ticket. I did watch the whole thing, so there you go. Buy something nice. I did not ask for my money back. Also, if you don't like Will Ferrell, I don't even think you would bother to consider going to this film, since it is a Will Ferrell film. You're definitely going to not like this film if you don't like Will Ferrell. You'll probably hate it. But something that I brought up when talking about Night School with Kevin Hart and Tiffany Haddish, if you like Kevin Hart, you will like Night School. It is a Kevin Hart film. He's a comedian who has made films, and they're sort of signatures. Like, some of his style and comedy is very much ingrained in it. And if you like that style, you will like the film. If you don't like Will Ferrell's comedy and his style, you will hate this film even more than the people who do like Will Ferrell and still didn't like it. So I'm going to take a quick break, and then we will come back and keep talking about the point that people have been walking out on the poor Will Ferrell movie, Holmes and Watson. So thank you so much. Stay tuned. We'll be right back after this break.
Want to know the latest and hottest music hitting the airwaves? Don't be left out. Listen to the Golden State Media Concepts Music Podcast. Keith keeps you on the loop with everything you need to know from pop, rock, hip-hop, and the top 40. And we'll throw in news of your favorite artists, concert and tour dates, and so much more. Listen no further, because this is the gold standard in music podcast.
Welcome back to the GSMC Movie Podcast. We are continuing to talk about the Will Ferrell and John C. Reilly film Holmes and Watson, which is out in theaters now. Before the break, I mentioned the point that people have been walking out of the theaters on this movie. Yes, that is true. And as I also said, if you don't like Will Ferrell, you're really going to not like this movie. But if you do like Will Ferrell, you probably just went because of the name, Will Ferrell, and thinking, oh, it's another one of his movies. I will watch this one too. I want to mention that probably the biggest thing that brought people to the movies, because again, it was not their advertisement, which was really very sparse. It's probably just the names of Will Ferrell and John C. Reilly, because there is like they're the comedy duo and they're bringing them back together. That's probably what brought most people in. It's not like people are like, oh, I've never seen a story about Sherlock Holmes before, because everyone has seen a movie about Sherlock Holmes before. And really, if you want to consider what this movie is spoofing, it's sort of just spoofing like the Guy Ritchie films, like Robert Downey Jr. as Sherlock Holmes. They very much draw from that, like scenes when Sherlock Holmes is trying to like calculate things in his mind, and you see the graphics come up on the screen as you're seeing like what he's seeing, and things go in slow-mo. They are spoofing that, but again, it's not like anyone really has asked for that. I feel like that's could be a funny idea. I just don't think it turns out to be very funny in this film. So I doubt you're going because you're thinking, oh, great, I love Sherlock Holmes. I can't wait to see him be made fun of. I don't. It's really just for the name of Will Ferrell and John C. Reilly. Also, as I said before, this film came out on Christmas Day. Also, this film had not been screened for critics before it was released to the public. Many critics hated that. And then the critics that did go out to see the film and then subsequently write about it really just like hated this film. They were very harsh about it. And yeah, I understand why. Sometimes even comedies that come out and aren't good in the box office become like cult classics later. I do not see this happening for this film. Again, so sorry. Also, my final point about this film is the controversy that has arisen about it and around it. So the first controversy, which I thought was very strange, is that the film has 2 different opening scenes, which is bizarre. So this was brought up because there is one opening scene that has been showing in the U.S., which shows like it opens up and Sherlock Holmes is a young boy. He gets bullied at school, and because of the bullying, he becomes this like logical, unfeeling Sherlock Holmes that we all know. But then there is another opening scene where you see Sherlock in a garden, not as a child, but as an adult, and he is admiring these plants, and then like Dr. Watson comes and tries to like jump into the garden, and he like falls into the plant and like crushes it, but the plant is poisonous and like that type of thing. Anyway, this was brought up by first brought up by a Reddit user who brought it to the public's attention on Reddit, and they were in Australia, I believe, and they said that they had seen the opening where Sherlock Holmes is an adult. And other users from like other countries that were not the U.S., like New Zealand, claimed that they had also seen this opening. And the reason they mentioned it is because they were like, this is different from what the trailers sort of said, that the trailer showed Sherlock Holmes as a child. So they're like, oh, this is different. And so people in the U.S. were confused. Granted, no one in the U.S. is going to know if like they actually changed the opening, because no one who saw it originally is going to go back and pay to see it again. Really, no one's going to want to watch it again. I'm sure when it comes out on DVD, they'll put both openings on, like as alternative scenes maybe. But I mean, is anyone even going to like buy it on DVD? Like, who even watches DVDs anymore? No one even has a DVD player except like your parents. Anyway, I just thought that was funny. People just thought it was really strange. And yeah, films have been known to have like slightly different tweaks and certain scenes and things like that. In different parts of the world, maybe like due to cultural sensitivities or just censorship things. But it's really unclear why they would just replace a scene completely in a film for different audiences in different parts of the world. I don't know if they were just like, it's doing really bad in the U.S., maybe we'll try this. I don't think it helped them, so sorry. So yeah, it's different versions that have been released to the public, not like to screen like review audiences. It's really out there, which is, yeah, that's just super strange. And I don't know if the other scene is better. I doubt it. Also, the last part about this film that I wanted to bring up is the idea, I guess I would say this is like a controversy, but it was an article that I read on the website The Verge, and I just thought it was interesting because they were trying to say this movie signifies like the end of big comedies, which is a bold statement in my opinion. But what they said, this is a quote from The Verge, as recently as 5 years ago, most years produced at least a couple of designated big comedy hits, like The Heat, We're the Millers, Grown Ups 2, and Ferrell's Anchorman sequel in 2013, or 22 Jump Street and Neighbors in 2014. But lately, the numbers have been dwindling. As 2018 winds down, the biggest straight-up comedy of the year is Night School, which has made around $100 million worldwide. That's a respectable take for a modest $29 million film, but it's still less than half of the earnings of The Heat or Neighbors. So they're trying to say that recently comedies, well, they're not trying, they're saying it well, that comedies like in 2018 and such, big comedies like Neighbors have come out as like, they're strictly blockbuster comedies, and they have come out and they have been successful. But then more recent ones like Night School have also been successful, but not as successful as Neighbors or The Heat. And they're saying this is a trend, really. Steve Carell is really like pursuing serious roles. Another comedic actor like Seth Rogen is really focusing on producing. Adam Sandler is focused on producing like comedies on Netflix. And this article makes the argument that Will Ferrell has really been the only comedian to keep to strictly making like blockbuster comedies for the theater. And I would agree with them. And I like Steve Carell as a comedian. I think he is a good dramatic actor as well, even with the bad critical reviews of from his film Marwen. Still, I think he's good, and I do believe this trend has been happening where comedic actors are not just doing strictly comedies, but doing other roles. And I don't know if that's maybe they sense the genre is dying or something, or they just don't want to do them anymore, which is then causing the genre to dwindle. Also, you can see that there are other like popular comedies, but they're really like a big cast of actors. They're not necessarily just like one comedian running the show. Kind of like you could think of like Eddie Murphy was one main comedian who would just run the show and make the movie great. And that doesn't really happen anymore. Like with Will Ferrell, he does buddy comedies, like with John C. Reilly. Or you get more of like a group of comedians, or even not even comedians, but a group of actors who are sort of put into these comedic roles, and that allows them to show some of their other comedic talents. You can see this in films like Game Night, which shows sort of like straight man actors like Jason Bateman or Rachel McAdams, and some people have argued this is coming from the idea of like ensemble casts of other actors who are comedians, but not who are funny, but not necessarily comedians. And that can be started from comedians like Will Ferrell, for instance, who did Talladega Nights, and John C. Reilly wasn't necessarily known for being a big comedian at the time, but he also brought in other actors like Amy Adams, who again was not known as a comedian at all. You know, she was an actress, more of a dramatic actress, but by making these ensemble or like buddy movie comedies, you have the one main comedian who then brings in other actors, whether they're comedians or not, and that can sort of like show out-of-the-box thinking, you know, and bringing in other actors who can stretch their legs in comedy, which may have then brought about what we have now with like Game Night, for instance. Another interesting thing about comedies right now is that maybe the funniest movie you've seen recently is like an action film. And that's been a really big trend where a lot of action films are kind of like make or break based on the type of jokes that they have, if you actually think they're funny. And I think a lot about, like, if you're thinking of like Deadpool or Ant-Man, these are action films. They're not comedies, but they're really just made by the jokes. And people will definitely enjoy them and go to them because of the jokes, like Deadpool, for instance. I mean, what would it be without the jokes by Ryan Reynolds? That's what's really... I feel like a lot of people love that about these films, but it's interesting that someone could say Deadpool is my favorite comedy when it's not technically considered just a comedy. It's like an action film comedy. Like Ant-Man is funny, but it's like an action film comedy. I think Deadpool's, you know, funnier and is more concentrated on the comedy than like Ant-Man. But again, these aren't just strictly comedies, which is really interesting. And a lot of films can, again, make or break based on the type of jokes they have. Still, with all of that to be said, I enjoy big blockbuster comedies, and I don't want those to disappear. I still go to theaters, and I would still go to big comedy movies if they came out in theaters. So I hope that doesn't go away. Granted, if we just get more movies like Deadpool and Thor Ragnarok, I would still enjoy that as well. So we're going to take a quick break, and then we're going to come back and talk about the film Stranger Than Fiction.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
The GSMC Movie Podcast. We're going to be ending our episode today by talking about the film Stranger Than Fiction. So, before the break, and earlier in the episode, we talked about the film Holmes and Watson, which is a comedy, but it stars Will Ferrell. So I wanted to bring up one of my favorite films, which is not a comedy, but it also stars Will Ferrell. Stranger Than Fiction, I think it's great. It came out in 2006, directed by Mark Forster, written by Zach Holmes. It stars Will Ferrell as Harold Crick. Also, it has Maggie Gyllenhaal as Anna Pascal. Emma Thompson is in this as Karen Eiffel, who is an author. Queen Latifah plays Penny Escher, who is the assistant to Emma Thompson's character. And you also have Dustin Hoffman, who plays Professor Jules Hilbert. Basically, this poses like the big general question, what if your life was a novel and a narrator told you were going to die? What if through all of your daily life you heard a voice? It's not you, it's not your head, it's an author saying what you're doing, describing your inner thoughts like you get in a novel. And then what if one day you heard that narrator telling you that your death was imminent? That would be awful and terrifying. Well, that is sort of like the main crux of this film. Basically, an IRS auditor, who is played by Will Ferrell, Harold Crick, suddenly finds that he's the subject of narration. He's the only one who can hear it, and the narration, again, begins to affect his life, like his work, his love interest, and mentions his death. So it influences his idea of like where his life is going and the fact that he's going to die, because this narrator, who has been right about everything else, is telling him this. So, he thinks, that it's going to happen. They're right about everything else. All of these things bring Harold Crick to go see a therapist who thinks he has schizophrenia. And then eventually he goes to Dustin Hoffman's character, Professor Jules Hilbert, who is a professor of literature, to talk about, what kind of narration is this? What kind of story am I living in? And it's really a quirky film. It has a very fun premise, but it's also very well done. All of the actors are wonderful. Of course, Emma Thompson is great. I enjoyed watching all of them. Also, I bring this up because I felt that I didn't want to compare Holmes and Watson with another Sherlock film, because I feel like a comedy that honestly is not good cannot compare to like the Robert Downey Jr. Sherlock and Holmes, which I just feel like it's just different. I feel like I can't compare it. If you want something serious, go see that. If you want something humorous, maybe see Holmes and Watson, maybe see a funnier movie. But because I wanted to bring to the attention of everyone that this great film shows that Will Ferrell can act in a dramatic role, and I think he does very well. This film has a lot going for it, not just in the acting. For instance, the cinematography. There's some really beautiful color choices. It also shows these like cold and sparse like versions of Chicago. It never really specifically says that it takes place in Chicago, but it is filmed in the city. But they're choosing these locations that just speak so strongly to identify the characters that they house, from like Harold's apartment to the college that Dustin Hoffman works at, to the pool that he lifeguards at, and all of these buildings really sort of like explain about the character and express their inner thoughts and who they are beyond just what the characters are saying, just what their dialogue is. Also, there is just a great use of graphics that appear on the screen. For instance, Harold, he brushes his teeth a certain number of times, and on the screen you can see like as he counts the number, it shows you the number going up of how many times he is like brushed on each side. Kind of like how the text messages come up on screen in House of Cards. It's similar like that, how you get the little visuals. And then you get, things like Dustin Hoffman's character, Professor Jules Hilbert, just like casually brings Harold to like the men's locker room and shower room for like just a brief chat. Of course he does. And, you see like like older naked men like shower. You don't really see anything bad, but it's just so humorous that obviously that just displays this character. The professor is so casual and he doesn't care. He walks around like barefoot all the time. Whereas the uptight Harold, who counts his toothbrush strokes, he would never just go in there for a casual conversation. And then, of course, you know, who's more body confident than like 60-year-old men at a gym. So it's just very humorous. I really like how they put the little tiny details in that just add to the richness of the story. Also, Will is very subdued here, so much, like, so different compared to his performance in Holmes and Watson. He is not the loud, immature, outlandish character. He's not the Buddy the elf who, you know, buys lingerie for his dad because he doesn't get what it means, or who runs in like a circular door and then throws up because he feels like it's like a roller coaster ride. Like, this is a very subdued character. Harold is very quiet. He's shy. He's kind. He's gentle. And I really enjoy seeing Will Ferrell in this type of role. Not that I'm saying he needs to do more dramatic roles, because I think he's great at comedy and drama, but it's great to see him be able to like flex those muscles. Also, just like anyone who ever thought that Will Ferrell wasn't a real actor, in quotes, can definitely be proven wrong by seeing this film. It's also just really interesting, the idea of like knowingly walking into your death, or just the idea that someone has to die to make a book ending good. One of the parts about this is that Emma Thompson, as an author, is writing a book, but it's actually about a real life person, Harold, and she doesn't know. And Dustin Hoffman, being a professor of literature, knows literature. He knows this author. And there's a part when he just tells Harold that Harold has to die for the sake of this book, because it's this author's best work. And it's not as good if he doesn't die. Like, the idea that someone has to die for the sake of good art. Like, that's such an interesting question. And it's so, you know, obviously every part of me as a human is like, no, of course not. Someone has to, you know, they can live. We can figure it out. But it is interesting to see the idea of, like, I feel like the trope of, like, an artist has to be in pain to create good work, or there has to be strife to make something, you know, some great sculpture or something. I just think that's a really interesting idea that they tackle well here in this film. I think also you just like, you feel for Harold because you want him to live his best life, but also if he had never heard that his death was coming quicker than he thought, he might never have, you know, decided to go out and live his life as best he can, because he never knows when he's going to die, but he knows that it will be soon because he heard the narration. And the idea of going to actually live your life and live it to the fullest, and not just spend your days, you know, doing something you don't like being an IRS auditor, for example, in Harold's case. And you really root for Harold. You want him to be happy. And I love that character. And again, it's played so well. And there's also this great question. Again, this is a spoiler, so if you don't want it, I apologize. Please don't listen to this part. But one of the ways that Harold is going to die, well, the way that should kill him in the book, is that he goes to save a boy in the street who's about to get hit by a bus. And you get this question of, like, is Harold doing this because he's a good person, or is he doing it because he knows that he is going to do this and this is going to kill him because he's read the end of the book, or the end of the draft of the book? So it's like, is he doing it because he just feels like I have no other way and I have to, or because he's a good person and he's kind and all of that? And like, that's interesting. Also, the idea that Emma Thompson's character, the author, says in the end that she couldn't kill Harold because the death was only good if he didn't know it was coming. But because he did know it was coming, the ending was no good, and hence he had to live. And then you kind of question, is that true? Does she really believe that? Or is it because she has sympathy and guilt and wants to save Harold because of who he is and because she feels bad about it? And really, in the end, the story is kind of quiet. It's like, as Will Ferrell's acting is subdued, I would say this film is subdued in that way. I don't think it's boring, and you have pops of color, like with the character played by Maggie Gyllenhaal, Anna. She is fun and lively and spunky, and she works at a bakery, and she's great, and she's this like great foil to Harold's character, which is just right for him, as he's being like, oh, I have to live my life to the fullest because it's going to end soon. I'm going to quit my job, and I'm going to, you know, follow this girl that I like. you get pops of color with her character, but overall I would say it is a quiet film, and it ends in a way that fits that quiet sense. The ending does not seem like it was forced. It just fits the film just right. And you know, maybe in this film the ending is not forced, but you almost feel like the author Karen had to force the ending because she didn't want Harold to die. So I just think seeing like a work of art within a work of art is really interesting. So I really love this film, Stranger Than Fiction. I highly suggest watching it. It's on like Amazon Prime. You want to stream it. Or probably you can just go to your local library and get it. But thank you guys so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed as I talked about Will Ferrell and said his name a million times. And I hope you enjoyed this episode.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Movie Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network, from movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.